Welcome to The Ask. On April 14, 2021, the President of the United States, Joe Biden, went before the American public, the world, and the people of Afghanistan to announce the total withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan. Following the attacks of September 11th, more than 700,000 American troops would go on to deploy and serve in Afghanistan over the course of almost 2 decades. In that time, to date, 2,312 Americans have lost their lives in Afghanistan, and 20,093 have been wounded in action. Somewhere along this monumental saga, 2 New York Times journalists, Catrin Einhorn and Leslye dedicated themselves to chronicling on film the story of how one wounded veteran returned home to try and pick up the pieces of his life together with that of his 2 sons. This effort started as an ambitious, year-long project before growing into a truly remarkable documentary film production that spanned a decade and has released this year over Netflix with the title Father, Soldier, Son. This is a film that can be best described as beautiful, heartbreaking, and inspiring, and I quote, an intergenerational exploration of the meaning of sacrifice, purpose, and American manhood in the aftermath of war. It is my great honor to host one of those filmmakers, Catrin Einhorn, on The Ask to talk about her work on what I will argue will be looked back on as both an important historical artifact and a timeless story of how a family hurts and heals after unspeakable tragedy. Since joining the Times in 2007, Catrin was part of a team that examined President Obama's troop surge in Afghanistan by telling the personal stories of one battalion's year-long deployment in a multimedia series called A Year at War. In 2016, at the very height of a mass migration of refugees from Syria and Afghanistan, Catrin and fellow journalist Jody Cantor wrote an important series about everyday Canadians adopting Syrian refugees, documenting the surprises, challenges, and intense relationships that arose over their 1-year sponsorship periods. And in 2018, she was part of a team that received the prestigious Pulitzer Prize for Public Service for exposing sexual harassment and misconduct in the American workplace. Throughout her career, Catrin has focused on narrative-driven work in print, film, and audio. Her work has also been recognized by the Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University Awards and the World Press Photo and Picture of the Year International Awards. Today, you can follow Catrin's award-winning work at the Times as she covers the story behind our fragile and finite environment, our blue planet, and the slow extinction of the animal kingdom. And now, she speaks about her work as one of the directors behind Father, Soldier, Son. Let us listen to the theatrical trailer and then meet our guest.
I worry about my dad at night because it's like dark and they can sneak. And then they can go, bah, 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 bah. My dad is a American soldier. My dad is my superhero. Joey, there's Dad's plane. See it?
I love you guys. It's a lot easier being a platoon sergeant than it is raising 2 boys by yourself. I'm trying to do my duty to my country and deploy, and do what Uncle Sam asks me to do. But, what's everybody asking my boys to do?
When I grow up, I don't know if I want to follow in his footsteps.
All I remember is snap, snap, burn, chainsaw.
It was hard thinking he actually got shot by a real bullet from a real gun, from a real person.
I absolutely wish I was still in the Army. I had an identity, and now, who am I?
I don't know if it's PTSD, but he's not engaging with us.
Everything's stressful. He's a lot more on edge lately.
You're not the one banging into frickin' door jams every day.
I'm not sure his injuries were worth it all.
How long do I stay motivated?
I think I'm definitely going to college, and he doesn't believe me. I do want to have kids eventually, and I don't want my kids to go through what I went through.
You always think back, would you change something, or would you have done this different? just keep going. That's all you can do. And fill your days with more happiness than sadness.
I would like to welcome you to the Ask Catrin. Thank you so much for your time here. We are here to discuss your amazing groundbreaking work on Father Soldier Son, together with your colleague, Leslye Davis, who unfortunately could not be here with us today. But thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me on and for your interest in the film.
It certainly is my honor. Let's start right at the top about the origins of this particular documentary. I know you've discussed this in previous interviews when discussing the film, but it originated out of a New York Times multimedia project that you were part of, A Year at War. This project essentially followed the 1st Battalion of the 87th Infantry based out of Fort Drum as they deployed to Afghanistan as part of the 2010 surge under President Barack Obama. Could you tell us a little bit about, very briefly, how A Year at War began as a project, and when exactly did this documentary begin to take shape within that multimedia project?
Yeah, it all started, you're right, back in 2010, and it was a team of us who really wanted to find ways to get the American public re-engaged with the war in Afghanistan. So the war had been going on for 9 years. You know, Obama was doing a big troop surge to try and bring the war to an end, but we felt like our readers were pretty disengaged from what was going on and were sort of fatigued from reading about it. And so our then military affairs correspondent, Jim Dow, worked with the Army to set up basically, a year-long embed with one battalion. And we hoped that by telling the stories of one battalion, we could bring some, personal stories and really kind of tempt readers back in to really re-engage with this huge piece of foreign policy that was happening, right? That was affecting so many lives, American, Afghan, and beyond, right? So that was the goal at the outset of Year at War, and we did that. We followed one battalion for a year. One of those stories, and one of the soldiers we followed, was a single dad named Brian Eisch. And I went and visited with his kids in Wisconsin, kind of late summer of 2010. And these boys were so compelling, right? We really wanted to show the effect of the deployment on these two kids who sort of had nothing to do with it, right? But how was it affecting their lives? And, I was really interested in speaking to them about their experiences. And, so often we talk to adults about kids and we have adults interpret the experiences of kids, but there was an opportunity here to really hear it from their perspective if they were open to it, because sometimes it can be hard, right? It can be hard for kids to process this stuff and to talk about this stuff, but these kids were so game. I mean, from the minute I sat down with them, they just opened right up and they just spoke. It was like they were desperate to talk about it, actually. I think they had just been waiting for someone to ask about what was happening to them. And they spoke with such honesty and they were trying to be so brave. They just, I just couldn't stop thinking about them, right? So I met Brian for the first time when he came home for leave. We were at the airport there waiting with his family as he got off the plane, spent some time with him while he was on leave, and then he went back. And of course, the first really unexpected twist in this tale happened a couple months later when I got an email from his dad saying that he had been injured. At that point, they didn't know. They thought he had stepped on a mine. It turned out to be something else, but that he was getting flown to Germany and then Walter Reed. And then, of course, we were able to visit him in Walter Reed with his family, and the story kind of went from there.
I see. And so there you were sort of following Brian as he was updating you about his deployment and then, of course, him being wounded in action. When did the conversation of the New York Times shift from, okay, we've been working on A Year at War as a multimedia project, but we think we have something in the way of a deeper and longer story to tell about Brian and his sons here that we would like to try and deliver as a video for the New York Times or some version of a video? When exactly did that happen in the process of working on the story for you?
Yeah, so because Year at War was a multimedia project, we had short videos that we did on several of the different soldiers throughout, right? So Brian and his family were one of those. I think that was a 12 or 13-minute short. And then that ended, right? In 2011, that ended. We published the last stories for that series and it was finished. And then a few years later, I guess 3 years later, we were talking about following up with some of the soldiers. And I went on Facebook to see what Brian had been up to. Like, I just thought, let me just see if, what is his Facebook status showing, right? So I just put his name in and he had a post that he had just written. This was on a Saturday and it said, well, I'm doing it. On Monday, I'm getting my leg amputated. And I was just like, oh my gosh, we need to be there. We need to be there. It wasn't as interesting to do a story about an amputation and the recovery. That's already been very well covered. It had been already, right? But I thought that dramatic twist could provide the spine for going deeper into these original questions that we had been looking at about how is this affecting the children? How is this affecting this family? Like, we had looked at how the deployment had affected the kids, and now we could look at, well, how does the aftermath of war affect the kids, and how does it change this family? So it was like the amputation kind of provided like a narrative excuse is sort of how I saw it. And so I immediately called up my friend Leslye, who I had worked with on another project. She's a young video journalist at the Times at the time, and just an incredibly gifted cinematographer and photographer, but also really a natural storyteller. And I basically said, I knew that I couldn't get there on Monday. My husband was traveling. I had 2 little kids. I couldn't leave them. Like, there was no way I was going to get there. But I knew that Leslye, one of her many talents is that people feel really comfortable with her, right? She has a way of getting people to open up also. So I knew that she would be great on her own. And so I called her. She was like, absolutely. And then, there was some begging involved in terms of like the higher ups, but they eventually came round and in terms of letting her be the person, right? Because there was some question about who was the on-call journalist, but she was the one. And so she hightailed it up there, and she met Brian, the morning that he was going in for surgery.
That's, for me, one of the things that stood out for me when I watched that moment in the film when Brian decides to have his leg amputated after suffering with the injury for many months and not being able to sort of get back to the person that he hoped to return to. One of the things that I took away from that scene was the degree of openness and trust Brian had for what was happening in the way of you and your team engaging with him at that point. Is because, once again, as you said, it was the very first day Leslye would meet Brian was the day that he was getting his leg amputated. So she didn't really have time to really introduce herself and build that trust. And I thought it was incredibly poignant for myself as a filmmaker to see that Leslye and the cameraman were probably the last persons in the room as Brian was put under anesthesia.
Leslye is also, it was just Leslye. So Leslye was doing it all herself.
Oh, I see. So it was just
Leslye. And mostly that's how, mostly for shoots, it was either me and Leslye or just Leslye. There were a couple, for exit interviews, we brought in an additional cinematographer a couple times, but really for the vast majority of the project, it was a 1 or 2 person team.
Well, that makes the achievement here all the more remarkable, considering that it was just the 2 of you who were acting as the cinematographers and directors for the film. But that was tremendous. The fact that Brian at that point had said in his mind, I want to open up my life to these journalists who wish to chronicle my story. I think it does take a significant amount of trust to invite people into your life at incredibly, highly personal, intimate moments like that, where he was just about to go under surgery. So I think it's a testament to the relationship that had already been built with Brian at that time, stemming from your work on A Year at War for the New York Times. So it was around that point when...
I think that's right. Yeah, I think...
Please go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I think that's right. The fact that he had been through a round of this with us already, right? Like, he had seen the short that we made about his family in 2010. And I think that gave him a lot of confidence. I also think that Brian and his family are really wonderful subjects for a documentary, in that they take a lot of meaning out of being documented, right? Well, not everyone would. Some people are really private and it would feel very intrusive. And for Brian and his family, while I'm sure sometimes it was very inconvenient and sometimes they would get annoyed, it was worth it for them because they seem to find, great meaning in it. And part of it is that since we've been done, he's sometimes said to us like, oh, it's too bad you aren't here documenting this latest thing that's happening in my life, which makes me think, oh, good. Like, he really, he did get something out of it himself. So that brings me comfort.
This is not part of the list of questions that I prepared in advance for the interview, but there was a thought in the back of my mind that perhaps the fact that this team of journalists from a very prestigious newspaper had taken an interest in his life and were there to follow him during some of his hardest moments, perhaps that gave him some strength that wouldn't have otherwise have been there. As you said, meaning to his struggle that a lot of wounded veterans do not usually get during their long road to recovery and back to a normal life. So perhaps he did see the value in terms of, as you said, a previous interview, Brian himself is sort of a very goal-oriented person. And so perhaps this became a goal of his to open up his life to this documentary and find meaning for himself that way. Returning back to the project itself, once again, as you indicated, at that point in time, the New York Times was now shifting and providing more focus towards its digital strategy in the way of multimedia offerings for New York Times readers, in the way of the short videos that were part of Your War. And indeed, that's increased over the years as the digital presence of the New York Times has become more important for the paper. But those are very early days. So I'm very curious, given the incredibly long span of this multimedia project, how was it for you and the team getting that sustained support from the documentary from your supervising editors? And how might institutions like the New York Times have a unique ability to sustain multi-year projects like this one?
This really was a passion project for me and Leslye. And we really did it on the side for years, because you're exactly right. It did predate the film and TV ventures that the New York Times is now very involved in, right? But this was before that. And so, we started off not exactly knowing what the final product would be in 2014, right? When we restarted, we knew we had this incredible footage from 2010 and 2011. We knew that that he was about to go on this new journey of sorts, right? And enough time had passed that it was going to be really interesting to see where the boys were and what was going on with their lives, and how had their father's service shaped them and shaped where they were, what their lives were like at that time. But, I think I sort of thought we would follow them for a few months, maybe a year. A year is a nice round number, right? To kind of follow someone. We never expected to work on it for as many years as we did, but we really just had to follow the story. And that was really what was, we would just report back to our editors, and we would explain why we needed to go shoot again. And we would explain why we couldn't end yet. And, we made our case and they were fine with it. But it really was like we were publishing other stuff. Like there was other work that was in the foreground, and this was what we did on the side.
Yes, that's a really sort of important thing that I drew from when I was sort of preparing for this interview, was the amount of work both you and Leslye were committed to whilst pursuing this documentary project. I think Leslye herself did some very important reporting on the attacks in Paris in 2016, for example. So both of you were engaged on other work for the New York Times around this project, which is, again, just a real credit to both of you for finding the bandwidth to balance all these sort of requirements in your roles as journalists for the Times. I think it's remarkable. I was taking a look at something that would be similar to this project in scope in terms of time spent. And the only similar project that I could think of was Richard Linklater's, what was it called? Boyhood. And in fact, again,
Boyhood.
Yes,
yeah.
Correct. And that's not a documentary, that is a scripted film. But Richard Linklater and the cast of that film were committed to telling a story over time. And funnily enough, it was once again about themes and issues around boyhood and manhood, which are strongly present in this film. So I commend you and Leslye, certainly everyone who supported you at the Times, to sustain this project for as long as you did. Because as you said in a previous interview, there were multiple times when you could have said, we've achieved our story and we can wrap the project over the course of making it. But you had the presence of storytellers to
recognize. Thank you. Can I just jump in?
Please.
Oh, you're just like showering us with praise. You're so sweet. Thank you for all your kind words. It really means a lot. I wanted to just say, in terms of thinking of other films, there's two films that I think pair really nicely with ours. One is Quest. If you've seen that film, it follows a child. I'm forgetting which city it's in, but it's a personal story of a family, and they're following a mom and dad and a child over time in a way that's a very, demographically different kind of family than the one that we followed. And I think that those two, they pair really nicely in that way. Another movie that it pairs really nice with, another documentary, is A Fathers and Sons. If you've seen that, you have to watch that film. I don't think that either of those were like a decade in the making, but they clearly spent several years following their subjects, and they're very different. So, A Fathers and Sons follows Islamic militants, basically. And the filmmaker basically did something that we journalists don't do, but lied to get access and said that he was, Islamist, militant, and was sympathetic to these very extreme ideas, and then captured this footage of like training camps and things. But it really also focuses on a father and his son. So in that sense, I think that they're interesting to watch together. And another film that would be interesting to look at it next to is your film, which I watched. And it was so great to see that, because when we were doing Year at War, I just, I didn't go to Afghanistan, but I kept saying to Jim and Damon Winter, the photographer, and Jim Dow, the reporter, like, can we talk to the Afghan National Police? I want to hear more from the Afghan National Police. I want to hear from the Afghans. And we did include 3 or 4 interviews with them. And of course, that project, the technology used to make that project is now broken, basically, because the internet is changing so quickly that a lot of these huge multimedia projects that we did are no longer even available. It kills me. So I don't even think that like people can watch it. But we did do a few interviews. The focus of this story was obviously of Year at War was on the American side. But I was just desperate the whole time to hear from the Afghans. And I was so happy to watch your film because I got to.
Thank you so much for pointing out Quest and what was the other name of the other film? Father's Sons?
Of Fathers and Sons.
Fathers
and Sons, yeah.
It does sound like an incredible film. I will have to try and seek them out. And I certainly hope anyone who's listening to this podcast interview right now does so as well. Did either of those films inform what you were doing for your work on this documentary, or did you watch these films when you were well past?
After. I watched them after. Yeah.
I see.
After, yeah. Yeah. In fact, I watched A Fathers and Sons way after. So startling to me because there is something that happened, I won't give away spoilers. Anyway, I watched it and like my mouth was opening sometimes because obviously it's the other side, right? This is like the enemy that Brian is fighting. And yet there were parallels with the story that were so startling.
I don't want to jump ahead, but I think the sign of a good film is tapping into the universal, something that you can understand across cultures and languages. And certainly you do that here, I believe, with Father, Soldier, and Sons. You touched on something very interesting when you were discussing just, the amount of time that was spent on this. This was a film that was 10 years in the making. Obviously, the world changed, the family changed, and technology changed around you while you were making this film. How did that inform the actual production process? Did you actually switch cameras as time went on, or did you and Leslye decide to sort of base it around one particular camera system or type?
We switched. And part of the reason we switched is because at the beginning, we started with a very sort of privileging the photography of it and really like that sort of a photographic quality to the cinematography. And that was both in 2010, 2011. And Leslye was also trained in that same way. She's a trained photographer, right? And shot, 5D cameras that gave it that look. But really, as we were deeper and deeper into the documentary, we really needed the ease of moving the camera around more and just having a setup that was more flexible and allowed us to capture action more. So, Leslye is the cinematographer on the film and she could talk about this way better than me. I did learn to shoot on this film. So I had never shot before this. And I went to a little boot camp. And so, ended up shooting a second camera, at times, not very well. But Leslye is really the pro here. And, if she were here, she would say that she really ended up having a camera that while it didn't have that same visual sort of drama, maybe, as the 5D, it just allowed for her to do so much more. It was so much more flexible for her.
And what camera was that? I think I might have missed where you shared that in the response. You mentioned 5D.
I can't remember. I'm so sorry, but I can't remember what that latest camera was.
No, it's no problem at all.
I'm going to text her.
Sure. And that actually, while you're texting Leslye, that really ties into, I guess, the next question that I have for you. When you're working on a film with 2 principal creative leads like you were for Father, Soldier, Son, one question that, I'll have, how did you collaborate? How did you split responsibilities? And you sort of previewed some of that in your last answer, saying that Leslye sort of took the lead for the visual look of the film as your cinematographer. And of course, you backed her up as a second camera. But tell us about that collaboration, how you complemented each other for the making of this film.
It was so many years. Leslye came on in 2014, but then there were still so many years of shooting. I feel like when it started, she was in charge of the visuals and I was leading on interviews and things. But I feel like over the years, she was interested in interviews and I was interested in shooting. It was less clear cut over time, I would say. And that was just really us having conversations about the partnership, right? And like, how can both people be happy in a partnership and what do both parties need in order to have their needs met, right? So I feel like creative partnerships can be complicated. And I guess what I think we learned is you just like have to be honest and open with each other. You have to communicate. And if like you're starting to get frustrated because, you're bummed about something in the dynamic or in just the roles, then like, let's talk about it and let's figure out how we can both get our needs met, right? I guess that would be my advice. So depending on how a project is set up, sometimes there are very clear roles, right, in documentary, and you hire the people for certain roles and it is very clear and delineated. This wasn't that because it was, again, we started off not knowing exactly what this was going to be and certainly not thinking it was going to be a documentary on Netflix. So we were just working as collaborators as we do at the New York Times all the time, right? I work with so much with visual journalists, photographers, and videographers over the years. So that's sort of how it started. It was just the way that we would normally work together. And then as it became bigger and bigger, we just continued to have conversations about like how we wanted, the partnership to work. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And I think it's a great thing that you were able to work together as you did for 10 years on this project. You don't hear of, obviously, in work, you'll frequently collaborate with a colleague for a given amount of time on a given story or given film even. But certainly a 10-year project is not usually heard of. So the fact that you guys were able to get through it and be friends at the end of it.
It wasn't 10 years. It wasn't 10 years.
Okay.
So, in the beginning, the person who really shot in the beginning was an incredible photographer named Marcus Yam. So he was the person shooting in 2010 and 2011 in the United States. And Damon Winter was, incredibly gifted photographer who was shooting in Afghanistan. So, and then Les came on in 2014. And I do have the name of the camera that we ended up with, which is the Canon C500.
Okay, I'm actually not familiar with that camera, so I cannot further elaborate on how it served you. But for those of you who are listening and wondering how, in part, Leslye and Catrin achieved a very highly cinematic look for their film, that camera was one part of that solution. You touched on something fairly interesting in that previous response. You did bring up the fact that this film project that began at the New York Times would eventually move and be distributed via Netflix. That Netflix came aboard this film in 2018. Can you tell us a little bit about why and how Netflix supported the completion of this film?
Yeah, so it became clear to Les and I that it needed to be a documentary film. We knew we had so much story and we knew that its best home would be off platform, right? And one thing that we had learned, I don't know if you listened to the New York Times podcast, The Daily, but The Daily had come about in the interim. Like while we were working on the project, The Daily had started this incredible podcast and it just achieved this tremendous success by being a podcast. The Times over the years had tried to do some podcasts on the website, and it just never really worked, right? Because people are not going on the website to listen to audio. But when we gave people audio where they wanted to hear it, combined with this incredibly talented team, that the New York Times hired to create this podcast, it was just an incredible success. And so we used that with our folks within the New York Times. And we said, look what the Daily is doing. Can we take this off platform? And can we take this documentary to a place where it's just going to make more sense for people to sit down and watch a 90-minute film? And when we first started talking about that, it was a strange request, I think, for our managers. But as the New York Times Film and TV, like that initiative was happening separately, but at the same time. And so when they heard about the project, and Sam Dolnick, who runs the film and TV department, when he heard about it, he was just like, absolutely. Yes. Like, absolutely. Let's see what we can do with this. So he was incredibly supportive. And then it was very easy. So we met with Netflix. We showed them some footage and then we made a tighter cut and showed them some more footage. I would say we showed them a sizzlier bit of footage. Like we really created some story instead of showing them something that were some really incredible scenes, but was a little more raw at first. And we knew Jason Spingarnkoff, who was our EP at Netflix, we knew him because he had worked at OpDocs at the time. So that was obviously helpful, right? That we had this relationship so we could go and meet with him and show him some footage. But it was really the second time when we really had to, it wasn't enough to just show some great footage. Like we really needed to show a great story. And once we could kind of encapsulate that in a reel to show him, then it was really easy. And it was a great experience working with Netflix, I have to say. They were just wonderful partners.
Yeah, to me, that's so interesting to hear. I didn't realize that even given the pedigree of the film, the fact that it originated from the New York Times and the guidance of you and your colleagues at the New York Times, it wasn't an immediate sign off from from the Netflix documentary wing. You had to come back and show them a little bit more. And certainly anyone who's listening to this and wondering how to best present a pitch, that's valuable advice. Do not show scenes, try and show a story if you can. That makes it easier for a commissioner to understand what they are investing in.
Put your scenes in a story, right? Don't just show them raw.
Yes, because as powerful as the scene can be, perhaps it would be even more powerful as part of a narrative.
Exactly.
And going back to the creation of these scenes, I think that, I was very interested in the process of how you worked with Brian and his family in the recording of this documentary. And there was an interview that you had with Brian with John McDaniel from Wounded Warriors in Action. I listened to it in the run-up to this interview here. And Brian shared a little bit about his experience of working with you guys on the film. And he said that he got to a point where he was actively reminding his family not to look at the camera when you guys were around. And so listening to Brian say that, it made me smile. The fact that he had reached a point where he wanted to deliver the kind of scenes that you guys were looking for, if I can put it that way. What I'm interested in is not so much how Brian felt that he and his family should sort of be around the camera. I'm really interested in how you and Leslye approached the work with Brian and his family. Obviously, recording days must have been long. Watching your film, it's very clear that during those days when you were shooting with Brian and his family, those were committed days for you and Leslye, where you were spending a lot of time being very quiet and trying to get as much as you can about Brian and his family on camera. Were there times when you would put down the camera and just join the family and just hang out with them? And what were those times like? And would you discuss the making of the film over the course of your years visiting with Brian and his family during moments like that?
So let me start out by addressing, that comment of Brian's about ignoring the cameras. That was really from the very beginning in 2010. We would say, we're flies on the wall. Please do not interact with us, because that was really, we really wanted a verite feel, right? And we wanted to be able to show what was happening in their lives. And we didn't want to be characters in this documentary. Like that was from the very beginning, we did not want to be characters. And so, when you tell little kids, Isaac and Joey, and their dad, just ignore us. Pretend we're a fly on the wall. Like as much as we can be flies on the wall, that's what we want to be. So they were very receptive to that from the very beginning. I mean, it wasn't just Brian didn't have to tell his family that, because his family knew, or maybe he had to tell like his extended family if they came over. But like the nuclear family, they just got it from the beginning. And when the boys were very little in 2010 and 2011, and when we met Maria in 2014, again, it's a pretty, I think people get it. And then really the big question is how comfortable they are around cameras, right? And some people are just going to be a lot more awkward and a lot more camera aware. And other people are just going to be themselves more, right? Just depending on your personality. And this was a family that was really able to just be themselves. And that, again, is why they were like such a great family to make such a long documentary about. You really couldn't do this for any family, right? There would be it just wouldn't work. It would be too stressful for the family. It wouldn't yield a good documentary. This family was okay with that. And yeah, like Isaac would constantly, like if we were, at a sports event or whatever, he would tell the kids, like, just pretend like they're not there. Pretend like they're not there. You can usually tell when people are hamming it up for the camera. And I think one thing that surprised us over the years was how little that happened. We felt like they were really being authentic with us.
I felt personally that they were very I mean this in the most supportive way possible. I think they were bored of you, in a sense. There was these wonderful moments in the film when these great, prestigious, award-winning New York Times journalists were in Brian's home. And what was he doing? Playing computer games. And that was the content
100%.
he was
No,
providing you.
exactly. Exactly. And that's what we would say, like, we just want to film your life, and we want it to be like we're not here. And so just do the things that you would normally do. And of course, to do that, this gets at another part of your question. Yes, we sometimes did put the cameras down and have, eat some pizza with the family or whatever, and chat with the family. So yes, we did do that. It's always a dangerous thing because I come from an audio background. Like, you just leave the mics rolling all the time, which you can do in audio in a way that you can't do in video, because video is just so much more cumbersome, right? But the minute you put the camera down, something amazing happens. That's just how it is, right? That's just how it is. And sometimes it's because it's not that they're acting for the camera, but they might be holding back something. And then the minute the camera goes away, that thing comes out. You do have to make people bored, because otherwise all the good stuff is going to happen when you turn the camera off.
It's extremely well said, and that was one of the things that really impressed me, was how, for a documentary like this, ultimately I think that your goal as a filmmaker is to reach a point in your relationship to the people that you're filming where they can no longer hide who they really are from you, or they no longer want to hide who they really are from you. And that's why I especially noted the many scenes where we see Brian sort of in his depression, sort of finding solace in these computer games, and his girlfriend at the time being concerned about it, and the fact that he wasn't, when you showed up, trying to be his best self for you and Leslye, I think spoke to the ease that the family had at that point, you documenting their lives. Moving on from, actually, no, I will stay at the work with the family for a minute more. One documentary that I watched as I sort of went through the motions myself as a filmmaker that sort of informed a little bit of, or made me question how I would approach my own work. I watched a film that was made years ago called Children Underground, about a community of homeless kids in Budapest, of all places. And it was a observational documentary. And there was obviously, as you could imagine, any film or any story about homeless kids has got to be hard to consume and watch, given the fact that they're vulnerable for the fact that they're minors, and then doubly so vulnerable because they are out in the streets. And there was a very difficult scene in the film where an adult puts their hands on one of the kids and kind of slaps them around a little bit. And I thought to myself, what would have I done if I was the filmmaker at that moment in time? Would have I stepped forward and interceded and tried to rescue the kid from the physical abuse that they were experiencing that moment in time, or would I have filmed it to provide their authentic story for a viewer? And I asked that in regards to Father Soldier Son, because there are scenes where we're watching Brian truly struggle. One memorable scene that sort of stands out for me is him wrestling with it's a comical scene, I mean, the way it's presented in the film, but it made me think, a little bit about your and Leslie's approach to filming Brian's story. He's struggling, I think, with a snowblower or some kind of device trying to get
snowblower.
That's right, a snowblower. And he's truly struggling with it to try and get it onto his truck. By now, he has his prosthesis, but you get the sense that at any moment he could tip over and injure himself, while you're watching the scene play out. And I'm wondering how important it was for you to have scenes like that in your film to show the struggle of this family and your approach to participating or not participating in these moments as filmmakers.
We love that scene. I mean, that's one of our favorite scenes in the film, and Les was there shooting that. And in fact, she's said this, so I'm not divulging anything that she wouldn't, but she actually does say, "Brian, are you okay? Do you need help?" And in fact, apparently, if you listen to the film very closely, you can even hear it faintly. Of course he didn't. Like, Brian is never going to want help in something like that. It's one of the really long-standing and ongoing conundrums, of journalistic ethics, right? Is when do you intervene? And when do you let something play out? And then what are your motivations for letting something play out? Because one thing is if you want to let it play out because the world needs to know that something is happening. But unfortunately, I think that that a lot of people are actually driven by ego, and maybe they have some other motivations for letting something play out. And it's not just about a magnanimous, desire to bring a story to the world, although that might be part of it, but it's also about what they're capturing and what they're getting and their career. And so I think it's a really complicated brew. And I think that at the end of the day, you have to live with yourself as a human being. You also want to be a good journalist, and people are typically drawn to journalism because they want to do something good in the world and help inform the world and documentary filmmaking, right? But I think it's like a case by case thing, and I'm not a conflict journalist. So I think I'm, knock on wood, I'm not in the situation, as much as like my colleagues would be. But, I certainly, as much as we tried to be flies on the wall, especially after Joey's death, if I thought Isaac was doing something that could get himself hurt, like if he was talking about driving all night, he was going to drive all night to do something, I would say, Isaac, are you sure you want to drive all night? Do you want to? And I would say that, and I would feel uncomfortable with saying that because it felt like this was sort of, as you spend so much time with a family and you've gone through them I'm sorry, I guess I'm giving away spoilers. You can cut this part if you want.
No, not at all.
But,
Not at all. This is your testimony about your
after
film.
we experienced such a tragic thing in their lives, and then I thought, oh my God, how can you just think about what could happen. And so yes, I did say things like that in a way that I wouldn't normally in a project, but it was really like if I just was worried about safety and well-being, very like physical safety, I would say, well, maybe you want to like break that up. Maybe you want to leave earlier and not leave at midnight and like have to drive all night. Consider it.
Thank you for sharing your perspective on that sort of issue that scenes like that present. And I will say it's one of my favorite scenes too, because I think it's a really great allegory for Brian's character, writ large, him wrestling.
Absolutely. That's why we love it.
It's a fine scene. And it wouldn't have been possible if you had put down the camera and walked on over and helped him up with that snowblower. I wasn't going to...
But it also wouldn't have been worth it. Sorry, let me just one. I'm sorry. I know this delay is making us talk over each other. I'm sorry. I just think that Leslye handled it in really the perfect way, which is that she kept filming. She checked in with him, and that was it. She didn't put the camera down, but she also didn't say nothing, right? Because if he had truly been in a situation where he was about to fall over and break his neck, it's just not worth it. It's not, again, that's where like your humanity comes into. So I think she just handled that really, really well.
That is great advice. And for any of you listening to this and are aspiring to be a journalist, don't forget to be a person too while you're pursuing your story. I wasn't sort of going to dig into this at this point in the interview, but you brought it up. And indeed, watching the film, an unspeakable tragedy does take place during the making of it, a shocking one. People heading into Father Soldier Son, the initial, and certainly myself as a viewer who hadn't done any sort of prior reading up on your film before watching it, we're under the impression that the great sort of tragedy to track is Brian's long journey of recovery from having been wounded in deployment in Afghanistan. But midway through your film, an unspeakable tragedy does take place, and you previewed the tragedy in a response earlier in this interview. Now, the reason why I would like to explore this for a moment here is because of the magnitude of the tragedy and how difficult it must have been for you and Leslye as people as well, because at that point you had spent a significant amount of time with Brian and his kids. They might have seen you as maybe their aunt at this point, almost like family.
They didn't see us. We were very careful. I don't think they saw us as their aunts. Like, I think we really did try to maintain boundaries, as difficult as it was. But of course, we knew the family very well when this happened. Sorry, I interrupted. Please keep going.
No, thank you for that clarification. And I think that's good for people to hear that, in order to make the story that you and Leslye felt those boundaries needed to be there. And certainly I don't know that the right approach there. So hearing you share that is a good sort of way of understanding this question that I'm about to present you with. Given the fact you spent so much time with Brian and Joey and Isaac at this point, how did this tragedy impact both of you personally?
I'm sorry, you just cut off at the end. You said, how did this tragedy impact?
How did this tragedy impact you personally?
Oh, us personally? Yeah. I mean, it was just devastating. Like it was just Brian called from the hospital and said that the doctor, crying on the phone, and said that the doctors had told him that Joey was brain dead. And we got on a plane. Well, I got on a plane because I was in Chicago. Les started driving from New York City, thinking that Joey was going to be alive for some time after that. Like that it was probably, it meant that he was probably going to die, but that there might be some time when he was on life support. And so we got there as soon as we could, thinking that he would still be alive when we got there, but he died while we were both en route. And so it was just awful. It was just terrible. I can talk about how hard it was for me and Leslye, but like when you see how, anything that we were going through just paled compared to what the family was going through. So I think that's, you're just so focused on the pain of Brian and Maria and Isaac, and then, their extended family. It was just devastating. So we just, how did we shoot? We tried to be as unobtrusive as possible. We never put lavs on them. We said to Brian, listen, like, this is not the story that we wanted to tell. This is happening to you. We'd like to film it. Is that okay? And he said, just keep it classy. And, we just would constantly say, is it okay? Is it okay? Do you, let us know if you want us to stop. But there was only one moment when he asked us to stop out of that whole, we were there like 8 days after, in the immediate aftermath of Joey's death. And there was just one moment where he asked us to turn the cameras off. And we, of course, recorded way more than we could possibly use. For us as filmmakers, it really brought up a question of, wait, how does this fit into our story? And wait, what is our story now? Because we had this great story and we wanted to tell that story. And now this has happened. And how do we integrate that? And what does this mean? But over time, of course, that showed itself, right? So it became clear. And then in the editing, we worked with a brilliant editor named Amy Foote. And we knew that it was just going to be, that restraint was what we were going to have to exercise a lot of restraint in that, because there's just this, the footage is so emotional. We didn't watch that footage for months or years. We just couldn't watch it, right? And then when we would watch it, we would cry. And then, over time, it became somewhat easier to watch. You just, I guess, get desensitized after watching it so many times. But it was really hard. And of course, that was one of the really hard and scary things it was when we showed the family the film. We sat and watched it with them, and having to sit there and have them experience it again was also very painful. At the end, Brian turned to us and said about the film overall, he said, it's true. It's true. This is what happened. And so we felt really grateful that, like, what a gift for him to sort of see himself presented in such a authentic and vulnerable way, and like say, yeah, that's true. And like, I'm totally okay with this because this is what happened.
I was going to say that going back to this beat in your film, I believe is what elevated it from a story about a military experience to a larger story about family in a significant way. And I applaud Brian for the courage that he had as a father to open that tragedy up to you as storytellers who were documenting the life of his family. And I applaud both you and Leslye for approaching an unimaginably difficult situation with sensitivity and grace, and paying proper tribute to the memory of Joseph and that scene.
Thank you.
We are coming up on near the end of the generous time that you've given me, but I hope to ask you a couple of last questions here.
Sure. Yeah. I'm not worried about time.
The last frame of your film features this unforgettable close-up portrait of Isaac, now larger than life, standing at attention in uniform. He has gone from the son to being a soldier, fulfilling a circular history in the life of the Isaacs. I can't pronounce the name for the life of me, but in that last shot, Aishas, thank you. In that last shot, I can feel all the pride, optimism, love, and fear a parent must experience when seeing one of their own children leaving the nest. And there's also just this brilliant question mark hanging over this last frame, suggesting what's going to happen next to the story of Isaac. I feel that way as a viewer when I watch that final frame. It's an incredible way to conclude this documentary. Tell us about deciding on this endpoint and how you arrived at it with Leslye.
it became clear, right? There were so many ways that we could have ended the film. We could have ended the film when Jackson was born. We could have ended the film, when, Brian had this whole reamputation of his leg, which we shot. So his, which was sort of symbolic too, right? As this war, this unending war is continuing. Well, this amputation, which was supposed to solve all these problems, didn't work. And he ended up having to have his leg basically re-cut off and go through a whole recovery again. And, was that going to be the end? But really, this was a story from the beginning, about the boys. We always thought that was what made this film different, was that it focused on the children and on the family in a way that war movies typically don't. And it just really made sense to start and end with the boys. And certainly given, this transformation that we see in Isaac, where he goes as a child being I don't know really what I want to do. And then as a teenager saying, I want a different path. I don't want to be a soldier. And then coming around to what he ends up doing and really wanting to go to war and thinking that is what's going to give his life meaning. It was pretty clear, I think, that was where we wanted to end.
Isaac is such an incredibly fascinating young man to watch in your film, because you almost feel like he takes on this immense responsibility onto his shoulders after his father is wounded. It just seems to me as if at a very young age, he felt responsible for his family, for his father, and for his younger brother. And when his younger brother, who was making it clear that he wanted to follow in his father's footsteps into the military service, when his younger brother is tragically killed, there's almost this certain sense of inevitability to Isaac about fulfilling his brother's dream of going into the military, doing that for the memory of his younger brother in a way, as much as it was for him and perhaps his father too. He is an incredibly poignant young man in your film, and certainly a character that stays with your viewers after watching your film. This film has gone on to mean a great deal to many people who've watched it. For Brian and his family, it's an unprecedented audiovisual scrapbook of their lives. For thousands of military families here in the United States, it's a powerful testimony to 2 decades of service and sacrifice. And now, with the release of this film many months behind you, going back to the film and with the release of this film now many months behind you, and Leslye, taking stock of everything that's happened this past year, the pandemic, and where we're at as a country in terms of the conflicts abroad in Afghanistan and Iraq, what does this film mean to you? And very lastly, where are you thinking of going next as a filmmaker?
Yeah, this film was just such a passion project for so many years. I am both grateful to have it done and out in the world. And, it is really gratifying when people write to us and say that they learned something about America watching this film, or, they learned something about sort of ideas of patriotism, masculinity, this sort of search for meaning, and the sort of intergenerational relationships that it explores. That's all very meaningful. I've been really wanting to work on climate and environmental issues for a long time, and I had been sort of fighting the urge for a long time because I was busy with other things. And so when this project ended, I was able to do that. And so now I'm on the climate desk at the New York Times covering the biodiversity collapse, which I just feel like these environmental stories are the most important stories of our time. And so I'm very happy to contribute to informing our readers and the public about what's going on. I love documentaries and certainly hope that another is in my future, but I sort of tell stories every way I can. So there's the print stories, there's audio stories, there's film, and they all come with their pros and cons, right? Whichever medium I'm working in, I'm always if I was only working in that medium, it would be so much easier, but it's what they all have their strengths and their limitations. I'm sure I'll find my way back to film because the narrative is really what's so creatively satisfying, I think, in film.
I think that going back to the importance of your current assignment for the New York Times, one thing that I think has stood out for many people in the wake of the pandemic, of the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020, and indeed 2021, as we continue to grapple with the effects of the pandemic into this year, was how when human activity paused around the planet in the spring of 2020, photojournalists around the world recorded a resurgence of our natural planet as the toxic activity we create subsided for a brief moment. I think that is something worth thinking about as we emerge from the pandemic and perhaps think of how we can pursue the pursuit of our species in a way that ensures the continuity of our planet too. So we look forward to reading your reporting on that. Before we leave this interview, I would like to note that as of to date, 2,300 American service members have been killed in Afghanistan and over 20,000 have been wounded. In Iraq, 4,400 American servicemen have lost their lives fighting in that conflict, with over 31,000 wounded in action. This story is a story about those servicemen and their families, and this is also a story about any family at any time who has had to deal with adversity and tragedy. And for that reason, it's a universal story. And I highly encourage anyone listening to this to seek out Father Soldier Son and watch it for themselves. Catrin, thank you for your time.
Thank you. I would thank you so much. I would just add that many more Afghans have been killed in the war, including many civilians. And so that is not what this film was about, but that's important to remember, I think, whenever we talk about the war in Afghanistan.
Thank you for that context. It was an honor and pleasure having you. Thank you for your time.